There's something strange about the way two people can live in the same house and still feel 1,000 miles apart. You start noticing it in odd places, like how the hallway sounds quieter even though nothing's really changed. Or how dinner still gets made, but no one bothers asking if the other's hungry anymore. I didn't have a single moment where everything broke. No shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic ending. It was more like a slow leak in the middle of the night, quiet, steady, invisible until everything you once depended on had already drained out. Her name is Melora. Not Melissa, not Melanie, Melora. A name that caught my ear the first time I heard it in college and never let go. She had this way of looking at the world like it was full of hidden doors and quiet magic. I fell for her before she even knew I existed. It took me 3 weeks just to work up the nerve to say something that wouldn't sound stupid. She made me nervous, and that made me brave. She laughed at my dumb jokes. I loved her before I even knew what that word meant. We got married in the fall, small ceremony, big sky. No spectacle. Just our families, close friends, and the smell of turning leaves in the air. I thought we were going to grow into old people who still held hands at the grocery store. I believed in that. I really did. But somewhere between year 7 and year 9, things changed. Not in a loud, fiery way. Just slowly. Like we stopped finishing each other's sentences and started finishing dinner in silence. She started wearing headphones more around the house. I started working later, telling myself I needed the overtime. At first, I thought it was just life. People get tired. People drift. We'd find our rhythm again. The hardest part? She never did anything cruel. She didn't stop loving me in some grand, explosive moment. She just stopped seeing me. Like I became background noise to her day. And that made it impossible to point to anything specific. I couldn't say, this is where it hurts. I just felt smaller and smaller every time I walked into a room she was in. Then came the night we talked, if you could even call it that. We were standing in the kitchen, both reaching for the same drawer. Our hands touched. She pulled hers away like it had been burned. I looked at her, not with anger, just confusion. She sighed, not annoyed, not sad, just distant, and said, "You don't need to worry so much about what I do. It's my body. My choice." It wasn't a scream. It wasn't even cold. It was flat, like she'd rehearsed it and didn't expect me to respond. But here's the thing, I hadn't accused her of anything. I hadn't asked where she'd been. I hadn't demanded answers. And that's what crushed me the most. She was defending something I hadn't even questioned. Like a wall had already been built, and I'd just shown up too late to stop it. I stood there, holding onto the drawer handle, not saying a word. What was I supposed to say? That I missed the version of her that used to fall asleep on my shoulder during late-night documentaries? That I still remembered the exact freckle on her left wrist because I kissed it every morning for years? I didn't say any of that. I just nodded and walked past her. That night, I didn't sleep. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the window screen. She faced the other way, breathing steady, peaceful, like the conversation had emptied something out of her and left it in me instead. I didn't leave the next morning, or the one after that. I still made coffee, still packed lunch, still fed the dog. But something in me had stepped out the door that night, quietly, without saying goodbye. She said it was her choice. So I started planning mine. I never told anyone I was planning to leave. Not my brother, not my coworker Jonah, who always asked how things were at home, not even my mother, and she called every Sunday like it was a religion. I just started noticing which shirts I actually wore and folded those into a smaller pile. Started using the guest bathroom more often. I even moved my cologne there. The one she used to say reminded her of our first date. It was easier that way. Less space to occupy. Less scent to leave behind. It's strange how you can live in the same house as someone and start behaving like a guest. I didn't realize how quiet I had become until one evening, I dropped a plate in the sink and flinched, like noise itself had become inappropriate. She didn't say anything from the living room, just kept scrolling through her tablet, legs tucked under her like she used to do on road trips. Only back then she'd glance over and rest her head on my shoulder. Melora had become a satellite, orbiting her own world. She still went to work, still laughed at something on her phone once in a while, still tossed her hair up in that same messy bun when she was cleaning. But none of it was for me anymore. None of it reached me. I was watching someone live, just not with me. There was one night, and I don't know why it sticks with me the most, where we both reached for the same charger. We looked at each other at the same time. And instead of smiling or joking, she said, "It's fine. I don't need it," and walked out of the room. Not angry, not cold, just empty, as if connection was more awkward than avoidance. I stood there, holding the charger in my hand like it meant something. It didn't, of course, but it felt like one more thread snapped. I started making mental lists, what I'd take with me, what I'd leave behind. I already knew I'd leave the house. There was no point fighting for the walls that didn't remember me. She belonged to the space now, not me. I'd keep the records, not because she didn't care about them anymore, but because I remembered which songs made her dance barefoot in the kitchen. And I couldn't stand the thought of her doing that with someone else to the same soundtrack. I wondered sometimes if she noticed what I was doing, the slow vanishing. The way I didn't ask about her day anymore. The way I sat on the far end of the couch like a visitor. The way I stopped offering to drive when we went out, even though I always used to. I wasn't punishing her. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I just didn't want to insert myself where I wasn't wanted. Then came the conversation that confirmed everything I hadn't been brave enough to believe. She had come back from yoga, or maybe it was a walk. I didn't ask anymore, and she sat down, took a long sip of water, and said something casual, like she was talking about a recipe or a news story. I've been thinking about doing something different with my time. Just something that's mine. There was no malice in her voice. Not even defiance. Just that same soft detachment. And I knew, without her saying anything else, what she meant. She wasn't just talking about a hobby. She was already making space for someone I wasn't meant to be part of. That's when I realized the leaving had already started. I was just the last one to pack. It wasn't an affair, at least not that I ever confirmed. It was something else, maybe worse in its own way. She had outgrown us. Or at least, she convinced herself that what we were had stopped serving her. And instead of telling me directly, she let time and silence do the talking. I walked past our wedding photo later that night. The one in the hallway with the soft natural light and her looking sideways at me like I was the only man in the world. I stopped, looked at it for maybe 10 seconds too long, and said out loud, though no one could hear, that man's gone. And maybe she already knew that too. I didn't go through her phone. Never even picked it up. Not because I trusted her, that word didn't really live in our house anymore, but because I didn't need to. Some people hide things. She didn't. Not really. She just stopped filtering. Her screen would light up at dinner. Sometimes with names I didn't recognize. Sometimes with emojis that made my stomach turn, but never enough evidence to start a conversation I wasn't ready to finish. That's how it worked. She'd leave her phone face up, volume off, screen dimmed. I think she wanted me to notice. Not to catch her, but to understand something without her having to say it. That's the kind of woman Melora became. She never confessed anything. She just left doors half open and waited to see if I'd walk through. I never did. Instead, I paid attention to the details, how she started taking longer showers, but didn't bother locking the door anymore. How she'd wear a dress on a Monday with no occasion, no comment, no glance toward me. How she stopped asking if I was hungry when she made something and started plating for one. At some point, I think she stopped seeing me as a witness and started seeing me as an obstacle. But I made sure not to get in the way. I wasn't heartbroken. Not in the way people imagine heartbreak. It wasn't loud. It didn't come with tears. It came with stillness, the kind that makes you wonder if you're still a person in someone else's eyes, or just a shape that takes up space near the laundry. I found a note in the dryer one day. Not for me, just something she had scribbled on a receipt and apparently forgotten. It said, "Meet me at the West Lot, 7:45. That was it. No name. No emotion. Just a time and a place, written like a grocery reminder. I didn't ask her about it. I didn't show her the note. I folded it twice and tucked it under my keys, just to remind myself not of what she might be doing, but of what she wasn't doing, choosing me. That night she came home late. No excuse, no lie. Just the sound of her keys and the same sentence I'd heard every week. You don't have to wait up. But I hadn't been. I'd already stopped setting the table for two. At some point, I stopped hoping she'd come back to herself. It wasn't about forgiveness or betrayal anymore. It was about recognition. She didn't recognize me as her person, and I was done asking her to try. The worst part wasn't what she did. It was how she made it look ordinary. How she wore a different perfume on Thursdays and never explained. How she hummed while folding someone else's secrets into her phone. How I realized I wasn't even angry. I was just invisible. And when a man starts to disappear quietly, it's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's patient, clean. He becomes air. He stops arguing. He starts packing small things in the trunk of his car and calling it donation. He starts leaving the TV on so he doesn't notice the silence. He starts thinking of exit strategies in terms of peace, not revenge. She said it was her choice. And now it was mine. It was a Wednesday. I remember that because the trash bins were out early and the neighborhood smelled like cardboard and leftover dinners. I had the window cracked open, not because it was warm, but because I wanted to hear something. Anything. Sometimes silence is worse than noise. Silence is where you start inventing truths. And I had started doing that more than I cared to admit. That morning, Melora was humming while making tea. Not a real tune, just a vague melody that didn't seem to have a beginning or an end. She didn't notice me watching her, and I didn't interrupt. That had become the ritual, me sitting quietly while she moved around the kitchen like she lived there alone. She poured one mug, just hers. The one with the chipped handle she always kept no matter how many new ones I bought. Then she left it on the counter and walked upstairs. She didn't even drink it. I stood there looking at the steam curling up like it meant something. Something small and unfinished. Something that used to mean care and now felt more like obligation. I didn't want to be the man who made a scene over a mug of tea. I didn't want to turn a small thing into proof. But I realized I had started collecting moments like that, subtle choices that didn't scream, just whispered, "You're not needed here." There was no confrontation between us. She didn't lie to me. She just stopped including me. Which, in its own way, is a more sophisticated kind of cruelty. You don't have to betray someone if you just slowly remove them from your life. And I started wondering, what if she was doing all of this intentionally, not to hurt me, but to make me leave so she wouldn't have to ask? That night, I opened our closet. I didn't mean to. I was looking for a sweater I hadn't worn in a while, but what I found instead was space. Space where her shoes used to be. Space where her travel bag used to sit. I hadn't noticed it before, but suddenly it looked like a museum exhibit. Everything left behind felt like it was meant for display, not for use. She came in while I was just standing there staring into the closet. "You looking for something?" she asked, not coldly, but not warmly either. Like someone checking in on a stranger at a bus stop. "No," I said. I don't know." And she nodded. Just nodded. No follow-up. No curiosity. She didn't ask what I meant. She just walked into the bathroom and closed the door behind her. The soft click of it sounded louder than it should have. That's when I realized I'd been measuring her absence in inches. A toothbrush left in the drawer, but never used. A jacket missing from the hook. Her perfume no longer reaching the hallway. There wasn't a moment she left, just a slow dissolving. Like she'd already gone and her body hadn't caught up yet. And me? I had stopped checking where she went. Not because I trusted her, but because I couldn't take inventory of a heart that wasn't mine to count anymore. That's the part no one tells you about. The leaving happens in silence. And if you're paying attention, you can feel every step of it. But by then, it's already too late to ask her to stay. There comes a point when even the most stubborn kind of hope goes quiet. Not because something breaks, but because the mind finally catches up with what the heart already knew. For me, that moment happened in the middle of a conversation that wasn't even important. She was talking about paint samples. I was nodding. I realized halfway through that I hadn't heard a word she said. Not because I was distracted, but because nothing about the conversation included me. It wasn't the words. It was her eyes. She wasn't talking to me. She was talking near me. It's a subtle difference, but it changes everything. She could have been reciting directions to a stranger. Her tone was flat, her gestures mechanical. I used to read her every movement like a language. The way she used to tuck her hair when she was nervous, or how her voice lifted slightly when she talked about something she loved. That woman was gone. This one? She was a version of her I didn't recognize, and more importantly, one who didn't care if I recognized her or not. I think that was the day I stopped asking myself if she still loved me. The truth is, it didn't matter anymore. There's a strange kind of silence that comes with letting go of a question you've carried too long. It's not relief. It's not pain. It's just stillness. The kind that settles into your chest like clean air in an empty room. I sat with that stillness for hours that day. I didn't speak. I didn't text anyone. I didn't scroll or distract. I just sat there, looking out the window at a neighborhood I'd lived in for years but never truly noticed. The dog across the street barked at shadows. A boy on a bike rode by without looking up. It was all happening exactly the same way it would if I'd never been there. And that realization didn't make me feel small, it made me feel awake. I started writing lists after that. Not what to pack or things to take. More like, what do I actually want to carry with me into the next version of my life? Which books? Which memories? Which parts of myself have I been neglecting just to keep the illusion going? It wasn't about running away. It was about not standing still anymore. Nalora wasn't cruel. I've said that before, and I'll say it again. She didn't cheat, at least not in any way I could prove. She didn't insult me. She didn't explode. She just shut off. Quietly. Intentionally. Piece by piece. And maybe that's worse than betrayal. Because when someone betrays you, you can respond. You can fight. But when someone simply drifts out of reach, there's nothing to push against. No closure. Just space. I began sleeping on top of the sheets. Not out of protest. It just felt easier, like I was already in transit, like I needed to stop pretending this place was still mine. I never made announcements. I never hinted. I just began living like I was almost gone. And in a strange way, she seemed to understand. She didn't ask questions. She didn't notice when I stopped setting my alarm. When I stopped filling up the shared calendar. When I started coming home later and later, sometimes not at all. She never asked where I was. That was the final confirmation, not of guilt, but of distance. We were roommates by then, neatly coexisting, polite, efficient, and profoundly uninterested in each other's lives. People think leaving happens with bags and boxes and keys slammed on the counter. But in my case, it happened in silence, 1,000 small moments where I simply stopped showing up for a life that no longer invited me in. She said it was her choice. And she was right. But mine was coming too. It's strange how goodbye doesn't need a suitcase or a slammed door to be final. Sometimes, it's just the absence of movement. Not leaving, not yet, but no longer leaning in. No longer trying. I realized I had reached that place when she asked if I'd be home for dinner, and I said, maybe, even though we both knew I wouldn't be. I'd been eating alone for weeks, sometimes in my car, sometimes in the diner 2 towns over where no one knew my name. It wasn't a punishment. I wasn't trying to teach her a lesson. I just didn't want to share a table with someone who didn't look at me anymore. We used to have this rhythm, this way of making dinner feel like a pause in the day. That was gone. And I didn't want to sit across from a woman who still said, pass the salt, but hadn't asked how I was in months. The bed was a colder place now. Not because she refused to touch me, but because I stopped trying to be close. Physical space was never the issue. It was the emotional void between us that made the blankets feel thinner. I'd wake up and lie still just long enough to make sure she wasn't pretending to sleep. Then I'd slide out of bed and start the coffee, sometimes without turning on the light. The less noise I made, the better. It felt like I was walking through a museum of a life I no longer belonged to, quietly, respectfully, as not to disturb anything. She had new routines, and I didn't ask about them. She left earlier, came home later. She went out with friends I hadn't met. She changed the shampoo she used and never mentioned it. She started wearing rings I didn't recognize. She rearranged the living room furniture one afternoon while I was gone, and when I walked in, the first thing I noticed was that my chair had been moved to the far corner of the room, facing the wall, next to a dusty bookshelf we never used. I didn't move it back. I remember sitting in that corner that night, not reading, not even thinking, just being there in the place I'd been pushed toward. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't cruel. It was just real. That was the moment I stopped planning how I'd go and started quietly deciding when. I didn't want her to notice. I didn't want her to ask questions. I wanted to slip out of her life the way she had slipped out of mine, gradually, respectfully, without making a scene. There was dignity in that. Not revenge. Not bitterness. Just closure I gave myself. I started writing notes, not to her, not even to myself, but to the idea of who we used to be. Memories I didn't want to carry with me but couldn't throw away either. The way she used to steal the blanket. The way we used to slow dance in the kitchen after doing dishes. The way her voice sounded when she'd whisper goodnight half asleep. I wrote them all down, folded each one into a small square, and placed them in a wooden box I never opened again. By then, I wasn't even sad. Sadness requires hope. And I was past that. I just didn't belong there anymore. Not in the house. Not in her orbit. Not in the story she was building without me. And that was okay. Honestly, it was a relief to name it, even if only in my head. You don't always get closure from other people. Sometimes you have to build it yourself. Piece by piece. Quietly. While the world keeps moving around you like nothing's wrong. She said it was her body. Her choice. I never argued with that. I never tried to stop her from becoming who she wanted to be. But I had a choice too. And I was ready to make it. It happened on a Tuesday. Not because anything dramatic occurred. No final argument, no discovery, no slammed door. Just because I finally had enough clarity to know I wasn't staying another week. There was no checklist. No deadline. I just woke up. stretched my back like always, walked into the kitchen barefoot, and realized I was done playing the role of someone's husband when no one remembered writing the part. I left the coffee pot empty. That was new. For years, I brewed for two, out of habit, out of hope, out of courtesy. But that morning, I didn't. I looked at the beans, the filter, the silence, and decided she could make her own if she wanted it. That was the first step. The next was my closet. I didn't take everything. Just what I actually wore. Just what still smelled like me and not like compromise. A few shirts, some old sneakers, the jacket I'd had since college that she once said looked too soft to throw away. I left behind anything she'd ever picked out for me, not out of spite, but because none of those things felt like mine anymore. It's strange how clothing can feel like memory. How a single sweater can carry weight that isn't fabric. I didn't write her a letter. That would have felt performative. She didn't owe me one, and I didn't owe her a goodbye in ink. Everything that needed to be said had already been spoken in months of silence. In skip dinners. In different schedules. In rooms we both entered but never shared. The hardest part wasn't packing. It was walking past certain objects and realizing they meant nothing anymore. The framed photo in the hallway from our 3rd anniversary, the one where she was laughing at something I said just before the shutter clicked. I used to stop and smile at it. That day, I barely glanced at it. Not because I was bitter, but because I didn't recognize that version of us anymore. That couple wasn't here. That laugh didn't live in this house anymore. I boxed up a few books, not because I planned to read them anytime soon, but because they were the only things that had always been mine. I remembered which ones she used to borrow, which ones she pretended to like. I left those behind. Let her keep the stories she tried to live in. I was taking the ones that helped me survive. She didn't notice I was moving out. Not at first. That afternoon, she came home late, as usual, dropped her bag on the counter, and opened the fridge. "Did you eat already?" she asked, without turning to look at me. "No," I said. "Not here." She didn't ask where. She didn't ask when. She just nodded and grabbed a yogurt. That told me everything I needed to know. I was already gone in her mind. She just hadn't caught up to it physically. And I didn't need to explain. What would have been the point? We'd both become people who no longer required each other's presence to function. That night, I slept at a friend's place. I didn't tell her. I didn't check my phone. I didn't lay in bed wondering if she noticed. I didn't need her to. The final act of leaving isn't physical. It's mental. It's the quiet conviction that you don't have to be seen, understood, or chased, because the version of you that needed those things no longer exists. I wasn't angry when I shut the car door and pulled out of the driveway for the last time. I didn't cry. I didn't clench the steering wheel. I just turned on the radio, let it fill the car with something other than memory, and drove toward a place that hadn't been defined by anyone but me. She said it was her body, her choice. And finally, I had honored mine. The morning after I left, I woke up to light coming through a window I didn't recognize. It hit the corner of the room differently. No shadows I knew, no familiar creaks in the ceiling, no dog barking next door. And instead of panic, I felt something strange. Not joy, not grief. Something steadier. Relief. There was no one to make coffee for, so I made it for myself exactly how I liked it. Too strong. No sugar. The kind of cup that clears your head instead of trying to comfort it. I stood there, holding it in both hands, breathing in the steam like it was the first inhale of a new season. I didn't miss the house. I didn't miss the life. And that surprised me. What I did miss, and what I began to reconnect with, was something smaller and much more important. My own voice. My own stillness. My own rhythm that had been buried under years of trying to make someone else feel whole. I started filling my days with small things, not to distract myself, but to remember who I was when I wasn't bending to fit someone else's story. I went for walks again. Not power walks. Just wandering ones. I let the sun hit my face and didn't check my phone. I called my brother. I read actual books, the kind I used to underline in college. I even started sketching again, badly, in a notebook I thought I'd thrown away. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I didn't need to narrate the exit. There was nothing to defend. Nothing to expose. It wasn't about what she did or didn't do. It was about what I stopped doing. I stopped staying in a space that had long since forgotten how to hold me. Weeks passed. I moved into a small place with uneven floorboards and a crooked mailbox. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Every lamp, every pillow, every moment of silence belonged to me again. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something or someone to return to me. The truth is, Melora probably didn't even notice the exact day I left. And that used to haunt me. But now, it makes sense. We weren't each other's anymore. And holding on to something just because you're afraid to be alone, that's not love. That's fear wearing a familiar face. Now, months later, I don't look back with anger. I don't need her to regret anything. I don't even need an apology. What I needed, and what I finally gave myself, was permission to begin again. And I have. My life isn't bigger now. It isn't louder. But it's real. I'm present in it. And every morning, I wake up to a version of myself that I actually recognize. She said it was her choice. So I made mine. And for the first time in a long time, I feel free.